Greetings, welcome to Brain Gauge channel. And today I'm going to talk about the metric temporal order judgment, or TOJ as it's called on the Brain Gauge app. And basically it's a very important measure, and it's very complementary to all the other measures so that you can get a full profile. So let's take a look at what we got. And here's the overall trend. Again, this is a composite score of the history of one subject as they got better. Here's the point that we've selected. Here's the raw data that occurs at that point, or a box chart of all the things. And here's TOJ right here. And that person did very well on TOJ. They scored 100%. So they're right in the normative range. Well, over here, you see that their TOJ was 18.8. That's in milliseconds. All right. So over here, the lower the number, the better. Over here, the higher the number, better. Most people just glance here to see if everything's green or red or somewhere in between. But if you want to do a little deeper dive into how that person is doing, you can see just, whether they're really super tester, if they're getting down to 10 or 15, that's really, really good. Or if they're on the other end of the spectrum, maybe their score was red. You want to take a look here and say, were they just outside the right range? Were they in around 60, or were they 120? So people, like an adolescent with ADHD off his meds is going to be really high. And if you want to see if they're getting better, if you want to see if they go from 100 milliseconds down to 90, down to 80, there's going to be off scale no matter what, until they get back in range of the normative values. So anyway, that's basically what that score is. Now, where does it come from? TOJ comes from delivering two stimuli, two little taps, one to each finger, and just saying which of these two came first. And starts it out around 150 milliseconds, and then goes each time that you get the answer correct, or whoever's testing gets the answer correct, then it gets a little bit harder each time until you reach that person's threshold. Just like reading an eye chart, they get down to the point where they can no longer do any better, and you're down to about 30 milliseconds. So anyway, that's a really straightforward task. And now you got to say, okay, what does this mean? What scores in temporal order judgment? If they get a bad score in TOJ, what exactly does that mean? And just to give you some examples of groups that do very poorly with TOJ, to start with, we've got, interestingly enough, these are all papers. Just some of them seem seemingly random. We go through the literature, there's a lot of different papers on different groups that have been tested with this test, tested with temporal order judgment. Botox being kind of an interesting one. Who the heck ever came up with the idea of testing people to see if some aspect of brain function went down with a Botox injection? But they did, and clearly it looks like they got worse. And so this whole list of things is not to tell you that if somebody has TOJ, a bad TOJ, that they're part of one of these groups. For example, if schizophrenics are the worst at TOJ, I mean, they never score below 150 milliseconds. I mean, rarely. They do very, very poorly at that test. But if somebody does really, really poorly, it doesn't mean they have schizophrenia. It could mean they had a head trauma. And, which leads me to tell you one other thing is that if you have a blow to the head, or like what we've seen many times anecdotally, is that when you get damage to the front part of the head, and say in a concussion, where the blow is regionalized here, TOJ scores do poorly. Whereas if you have damage back here at the cerebellum, timing perception does poorly. So it's kind of interesting. Both TOJ and timing perception are timing measures per se, but they are treated very differently. TOJ has to do more with that specific which order judgment, and timing perception has to do more with coordination and organizing everything and making sure, and that kind of circuitry. But anyway, the way people figure out what is responsible for TOJ or what is affiliated with it is you do a lot of different studies of a lot of different neurological disorders. You do some imaging studies while people are doing the TOJ task. And there's different types of imaging studies. You can do, like MRI, functional MRI, you can do MEG, you can do EEG, or you can do TMS, where you actually block activity in certain areas. But from those different types, it does appear that parietal and temporal lobes are definitely involved. And there's also evidence for the frontal areas. So those are just things that if they're bad, you're going to want to improve. That's the main thing. But there is some evidence that some types of training may actually get you a little better at TOJ. Speed drills might get you better at TOJ. But anyway, that's one thing to think about. The other thing to think about is when people do really poorly at this, like if they all their other scores are good, but TOJ is really bad, you may want to give them a little bit of coaching, especially if they're answering every question completely wrong. Then their scores get really bad. So what you want to do is just tell them, hey, instead of thinking about which stimulus came first, focus on which stimulus came last. Sometimes that really helps. About 20% of the people that do poorly really improve their scores, just changing that percept. Anyway, that's all for today on temporal order judgment. If you have any questions about TOJ or anything related to the brain gauge, give me a holler and I'll do my best to answer the questions. Thanks for coming.